And we're back. We're live, and we've got Zanita back. Good to
Yeah,
have you back this week, Zanita. We missed you last week.
thank you. Yeah, I was away at South Queensland Big Camp.
Yeah, you were. And we were very thankful to have Josh fill in. We talked a little bit about prayer and maybe the expectations we place on ourselves and God, and trying to control God with our prayers in some ways. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. It went a lot of cool places, different places. But how was Big Camp? How'd you go?
Big Camp was definitely quieter this year. I think a lot of people were afraid of potential sicknesses.
Yep,
But
yep.
it was still awesome. Like we of course got a dump of rain, which is like a given with any big camp,
Is
I
that
feel.
usual with camps?
Yeah, I feel like what is camp without like a flash flood? um, but yeah, it was good still. I think the highlight for me was probably in the main tent, there was a children's speaker who was blowing everyone's minds. Like it was like the highlight of children's and adults' days. And the first time I heard him like tell this story, I thought it was the sermon, and then he got down after 5 minutes, and I was like, "Wait, is that it? Like, tell us more!" like, so he was like the star of camp, and then yeah, it was just good to be back at camp after a few years, I think, and you know we've missed it, I think. So yeah,
Yeah, for sure. There's something about meeting together, with people, especially at camps. People come from far away. You don't always see those people regularly, so it's nice to catch up and to hang out. And you were plugging Signs, which is a very noble endeavor. You were on the Adventist Media stand there. So I hope if you are watching this at some point and you did go to camp, you said hi to Zanita there. Um, we got some cool stories, I think, to come out of Signs, which we'll tell at different points in different ways down the track. But yeah, really nice to be able to get up there.
I
Um,
actually had a lot of people come up to me and say, "Oh, we've been loving Record Live," and up until that point, I just saw numbers. I never knew who was kind of like jumping on to watch. And so
right.
as soon as I heard that people were actually watching, which I knew, but now I'm like, oh man, people are watching this. Like I actually know that now. like, so it adds
No,
another.
that's cool. That's really cool. So you met some of our Record Live family. That's awesome. And yeah, they were generally happy. No one had too many complaints.
No, they all had positive things to say. So
That's really
we're all
great.
good. What
Well,
have
I
you,
enjoy.
Darren?
Sorry.
What have you been up to in the last week?
Oh, just scrambling with deadlines. We've got 3 magazines that we're working on this week that have deadlines, various deadlines for different things, and it just, yeah, it's draining my brain to put on a different hat every 5 minutes to fix a problem for one magazine or the other. But yeah, it is what it is. It's good fun. So we're getting there. And my daughter is teething at the moment. Her big molars at the back, so she's not completely happy all the time. So it's an interesting time, but hopefully soon we'll be through it and we'll stick it out. So it's all good. But
Awesome.
yeah, I was going to say I do enjoy our Record Live chats, and I'm really glad that you're back with us, Anita. And we're talking about a really interesting topic today. And I think the inspiration, I suppose, for this topic comes from this Sabbath's record coming up. When we're recording this, the next record to come out is the 1st of October issue, and it's coming out hopefully in churches around Australia and New Zealand. I haven't received my copy on my desk here yet, so um, I'm still waiting and with excitement to see it. But it looks really cool. It's got a bit of a surfing picture on the front. It makes you feel like getting out to the beach and getting in the water. Um, but yeah, Zanita's got the cover article in that issue, and we've got as one of our main features. It's sort of about the art of surrender, talking about surrender. Now, surrender, um, we sing about it, we talk about it in church quite a bit. Probably not so much in everyday life. It's sort of becoming a bit more of a one of those words we don't use that frequently, I imagine. But in church and in, I guess, army scenarios or wrestling, when you're wrestling with someone, you'd surrender. Um, to them or yield. But yeah, we're going to talk about surrender today. So tell us what started you thinking along the lines of surrender, or what does it have to do with surfing? Oh, we have an airplane coming across just when I asked her, just when I threw her that question.
I don't know if we've told the audience that yet, that I actually live next to an airport. So every now and then we get these loud sounds. So just a disclaimer for anyone wondering what's going on in my end. But yeah, surrender. Where that came from was basically oftentimes when I have to write about something, I just think about what is on my mind and what I'm either like struggling with or thinking about or what is happening. And I think probably for a little while now, surrender has been one of those things that I've really like had to wrestle with. So this article was kind of born out of a place of like frustration and confusion, if I'm being completely honest, because I think it's one of those words that we throw around so much and we sing about so much, but like we don't, like, not all of us know what that actually means. It's sort of just a flashcard word that we give and that we say and that we sing and don't stop to think about or like don't assess what that practically looks like. And so I kind of just went on the journey of unpacking that a little bit in this article, what my journey was like and what my thoughts are. And yeah, that's how it began, really.
Why do you think it's important for Christians to even begin to wrestle with this word and this concept? Well, where do we start? How do we engage in, and why even should we? I guess is a place to start. Why should we surrender? Do you think, in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, I guess to answer your first question, it's important because I think if we don't understand what it really means, then we might have wrong expectations or assumptions, and so maybe we'll get angry at God because he's not doing what we asked, or because, we said we surrendered, so why haven't you fixed this, or why is it not going away? And so it can create further problems if we don't really understand it. And I think that was sort of my experience. It's like I have this memory of my childhood where my dad used to tickle me, and I used to hate being tickled, and so, but at the same time, I would be like laughing, and so it was like this war of like who would win, like would I be able to survive like the tickle war? And as soon as I yelled surrender, he had to stop, and so then I was like, everything was over. I was safe. I was like not in like tickle torture anymore. And I think I had the same idea, like when I vocally say to God, like I surrender something, why don't my situations or my emotions or my feelings change? And so in the past, when things haven't changed for me, it's then caused me to be like angry towards God or upset with God. And so that's when I started to think like, well, maybe my understanding of surrender is wrong. Maybe that's not what surrender looks like, and maybe that's not what he's promising. And so I think that's why it's important to sort of unpack it so that we don't gain those feelings towards God that maybe are unfair.
It's like kind of like what we touched on last week, and it's also, I wrote an article this past week about, I guess, unmet expectations, which is what you've brought up as well. And I guess, it seems quite, I love these Record Live conversations because it's an opportunity to define what we mean by some of these things and explore how we're feeling and thinking, and it's important to do, I think, as you've reflected, because otherwise we can put God in a box, or try and, our relationship with God gets out of whack in some sense because we're on our own. Thoughts and feelings might take over rather than understanding what even the Bible says, or what our faith is. It's very easy to fall into practices that are just how things are done, or how our personality leads us, or how other people influence us from outside of faith, how just people live, in general, because we don't necessarily grapple with some of these concepts. And I think I've heard that some people, I guess, have trouble forming a relationship with God, or going deeper, or growing, or knowing what that might look like. And maybe surrender's part of that, that's not talked about a lot, or not, wrestled with by some of us anymore. So maybe we should define it a little bit before we go too much further. In your article, you painted a picture like a metaphor. I really like metaphors and pictures, word pictures, because it helps me to grapple with concepts when I have some kind of baseline. And it's not that it's a picture that's complete and that covers everything, or it's not that it does all the work, but it has its failings. But what's the picture that you sort of are describing? Give us the baseline metaphor, so we can explore surrender through that concept.
Yeah, well, I am a surfer, and when I'm in the surf, the word surrender is actually quite a common word. Like, it's thrown around a lot. Like, people are like, just surrender to the ocean. And sometimes I wonder, I'm like, what do you mean by that as well? But like, that's probably just me overthinking things. I don't know. But I guess when you're out in the surf, like, the conditions are constantly in flux. Like, when I first started surfing, I thought I would progress in a certain way, like I did in other sports or activities. But I actually still to this day find it like an incredibly difficult kind of like sport or activity, just because things are constantly changing. And so it's kind of hard to feel growth.
Right. So, because what you mean by that is so much is out of your control. The wind changes, or the waves are different strength or different power. You feel a set of waves coming in. They're all a bit different, like smaller or larger, or do you know what I mean? You can't control the situation around you as easily as you can in other sports. There's lines, and everything happens between the lines, and nothing much changes. That's sort of what you're describing in the ocean.
Yeah, and I think the same thing when you go surfing, you have certain expectations about what that surf is going to look like. Like, you're going to get heaps of smooth, long waves, like it's going to be a beautiful time, and all of that. And then sometimes when you go out, even sometimes when you look at the surf, you're like, yeah, it looks great. You go out and you're like, what is this? This is a mess. And if you don't kind of like surrender, like the surfers say, or like assess what to do in the situation, then you're probably going to have a really like miserable, frustrating time out there. And so I guess part of what I was explaining in my article was that like sometimes surrender in the ocean, when you're like trying to go over a wave or get through a wave, it looks like letting go. Like, it looks like just protecting your head and like letting the wave like toss you over. Otherwise, you're just going to lose all your oxygen, and you're going to be fighting to get out of the wave, and you could potentially drown, but it's just not going to be enjoyable. Other times, like surrendering in the ocean asks you to like look at your surroundings, or like figure out where to paddle, or to change your like technique even. And so it's more about like, this is how surfers would describe it, like, what is the ocean requiring me to do in this moment, versus like, what is the experience that I'm wanting, and how can I control this kind of thing? Because I think that's the thing with surrender, is that like the opposite of surrender is control. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but we're all control freaks basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so when things don't go our way, like, we react in all sorts of ways.
Been thinking about control a lot lately. When you're in the waves, sometimes you have to, as you said, adjust your expectations, because I know I've gone in and thought this is great, jump around in the waves or whatever, and then you realize, oh, it's a bit stronger, or there's a bit of a pull, current pulling me out. I've got to actually modify my behavior, or what I'm going to do, because of the circumstances that I'm found in. I remember one time we went in, we were doing some bodyboarding up north New South Wales sort of area, and basically it was quite dumpy. In other words, the waves kind of come around. For those who aren't surfers, it drives you into the into the ground. And I got picked up by one of these waves. We were jumping through them, and it's like, okay, this is not going to work how we normally do it. But I got driven basically straight into the ground, and I'm actually thankful, because I've heard of people who have died from that sort of thing happening. My shoulder, I came out of the surf with a massive graze on my shoulder and no wind in my lungs, because the ocean just I hit the ground so hard I got winded, basically. And I have no idea to this day. I think God maybe put a little bubble of protection around me. I have no idea to this day how I didn't go headfirst into the floor of the ocean and like get knocked out or something, because I hit hard and my shoulder was all scraped up. I don't know how my head got out of the way to not be impacted. It's crazy. It's stuck with me, all these years later. That was like when I was a teenager, sort of thing. So I guess one concept of surrender is like you do have to let the wave take you sometimes. You try and go over it or under it. You have to figure out, do I go over it? Do I go under it? It's going to control me. But then sometimes you just have to go, well, I'm just going to go with it. I'm just going to let go and let the wave take me where it wants to take me, because I just can't deal with it. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that's the thing. Like sometimes for some people who are especially like holding on to that control in all their situations, then for you, surrender might look like stepping back or might look like ceasing to act. I think though for other people, like sometimes maybe God doesn't want us to just like give him the wheel. You know how people are like, give God the wheel or take the wheel. I think there's a song like take the wheel, Jesus.
Jesus, take the wheel. Yeah.
Like maybe that's not what he's wanting us to do in terms of surrender. Like maybe he's actually wanting us to like work with him, because I think he has given us like autonomy of our lives, and he's said that we can ask for things like wisdom and discernment and boldness, and like these are ours to use. And so sometimes it's about stepping into those things and like asking like, what are you trying to do here, or what can I do here that can change my circumstances, or
so we're coming back to that word control, I guess. letting God have control of my life doesn't necessarily mean that I make him do it. My friend used to tell me this joke. You've reminded me of this, like, I don't know if it's a joke or these like little anecdote, little stories about a guy, the waves are rising and he's in a flooded area, and like he's praying to God, save me, God save me. And then a canoe comes along, and then it's like, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. And then a boat comes along, obviously with our Adventist, state of the dead eschatology, we don't believe in the heaven scene where he gets to God and says, hey, why didn't you save me? And God's like, I sent this, I did this, I did it, and you didn't take the tools. So what you're saying is we can't just sit back and like always let God. Surrender doesn't mean God doing everything for me, is what you're saying in a nutshell. Surrender sometimes means me acting, but towards God's interests rather than my own. Is it about what I'm getting out of it, or what do you think? I understand when you're saying God sometimes expects us to act, but what's the cause, or why does God, how is it surrender if I'm doing it for my own benefit or my own, like I'm getting something out of it? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess maybe it's like, well, it's not always for our benefit. Like we obviously have certain ideas about what we want our lives to look like. And sometimes it comes back to control. Like we keep trying to control that or make that happen. And if things aren't going the way we want and they're not going according to plan, then that's when we get frustrated and we struggle. Like it becomes really difficult for us. And I remember like the light bulb moment for me when it came to surrender was I heard Eddie Hippolyte, who we had on here like a month ago or so. He was once speaking and he said that surrender means that we stop fighting God in the places he's trying to change us and bring growth in our lives. And so that was like a light bulb moment for me, because I was like, oh, like that's when I realized like maybe surrender isn't such a passive thing. Like, and it actually is for my good if I'm growing and if I'm changing. It doesn't mean that like it's the way or the thing that will make me the happiest. Like surrender doesn't necessarily mean like the happiest outcome or the easiest outcome. Sometimes surrender will be really difficult and you'll have to do things that you've never had to do, or that you don't know how to do, or that you feel uncomfortable doing.
Right.
I guess that's the point of like giving our lives to God, that it's no longer our lives that are the main priority. We kind of sign up to his plans. And I don't know if that answers your question, but
Say that again from Eddie. What was the I think it's a good thing to reiterate, to remind
yeah,
ourselves of. So
good.
fighting, not fighting.
Surrender means we stop fighting God in
Mm-hmm.
the places that he's trying to change us and bring growth in
Mm-hmm.
our lives. So I think like a good thing to ask yourself is like, where are you fighting change and where are you fighting growth? Like, are you being stubborn? Are there circumstances that are happening
Right.
because of your own behavior? Like, are you trying to maintain full control?
Mm-hmm. And is that God? I guess it's about knowing God's voice as well, because that's hard. That's sometimes hard for us to figure out, is this the Holy Spirit or is this something else? Because it's not that we should go along with everything in
Yeah.
life, or in, we might resist change if there's I don't know, bad change that's coming from a bad place. Like it's not a positive thing. Yeah, all right. We had a good comment come through from YouTube. Surrendering our will is the hardest thing to do. I've learned that even doing good could still be against God's will. Thanks, Charles, for sharing that. That is a really interesting point, and I believe it. But let's assess that state. That's a big statement. Doing God could be good. Sorry, doing good could be against God's will. Do you agree, Zanita? Do you agree?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a circumstance
I can think of one if you.
Yeah, you
If
go.
I guess I'm thinking of people that do, I guess, church work or church programs. We could say church programs or church things, and they can get so caught up in, I guess, the business of church. I guess we have the story of the Good Samaritan, but the Levite, the priest, they're not necessarily doing bad things. They're not bad people. They're just caught up on their mission or what they see as their good work to do, that they forget the God interruptions, or the God, we talked last week about God interruptions or God appointments, God opportunities, where God, he actually has something for us to do that we need. It's an opportunity. It's just, we might not like it. It's hard, or it's change, or it's growth. But instead of just doing good stuff all the time, it could be good, but is it the greatest, or is it the best, or is it God's will? I used to think, I guess I've evolved my own understanding of this. I used maybe a simplistic or childish understanding that there was maybe one path, one soulmate, one track, one thing that was God's will, and anything outside of that was not God's will, was the wrong thing. I've started to believe that God could use me in many different areas, say career, or places, or geographically where I live, or which church I'm part of. It may not be just one church. I'm not talking about denominations. I'm just talking about my local church. If there's more than one church around, I could serve in God. I won't say God doesn't care. Like, God cares, but maybe God doesn't. It doesn't matter to God if I'm in this place or that place, or if I'm doing good in certain areas, but he actually just wants me to do the best I can in the place that I'm placed. But at the same time, I can also, so there may not be a wrong way for me to be living out his will, but it's wrong if I'm doing good things, but it's not what his will is, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm doing church work, but I'm not discipling my family at home. I'm doing, you know, a soup kitchen or something. I don't know, but I'm not happy about it, or I'm doing it for the wrong reasons, or do you know what I mean? I don't know. You can do good things for the wrong reasons, I suppose, is what Charles is saying, and I tend to agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think you can also probably do things that look bad for the right reasons. Like, for example, like surrender for someone might look like setting boundaries with like how much they're serving in the church, which sounds a bit odd, but like if you're the kind of person who just like gives and gives and gives constantly and doesn't have those personal boundaries, then maybe that's what surrender looks like for you. And some people might look at that and be like, what are you doing? Like you're not giving your life to God or whatever. But yeah.
Another good biblical example, just to go back to the text, Martha in the kitchen, she was doing good things. She was preparing food, I suppose. But Jesus was complimentary to Mary for actually sitting at his feet and soaking up, because that's what was needed at the time. That's what was the priority at the time. So yeah, I guess there are ways to do good things against God's will in that sense. It brings me to the word that we don't often hear a lot or use a lot, or that I wrestle with lately, is conviction. I grew up on missionary stories, Desmond Doss, people that kept the Sabbath in the army, stories like that. It's like high level of commitment, conviction, etc. And they're sort of surrendering their own, sometimes health and well-being, but certainly comfort or career opportunities, or they're surrendering things because they're convicted that that's what they should do. Do you feel like people, maybe in our generation even, are struggling more with conviction, like they would go towards comfort, or does it just look different for a new generation of the church? Or are we still as convicted and as surrendered as we are? Because I think conviction and surrender are similar, they're related.
Yeah. I think we live in a very individualistic culture, so we think about ourselves a lot more than probably we think about like the village or the tribe or the community or the family.
Right.
I think that comes into it, and I suppose the lingo is more so like, do what makes you happy and do what your heart tells you to do. Like that's kind of what you hear going around, to like follow your heart and follow your dreams. Whereas that's kind of a new concept. like I guess previously, like people, or even now in a lot of places, like people don't have the privilege to just follow their dreams, or it's a very like modern day kind of concept. But I don't know, I think you were mentioning recently in one of our conversations, like why you were wrestling with this and where that kind of came from. So maybe that's something you want to expand on.
I just think, I don't know. The society, I think, as you've described it, the picture that you've painted of society leading more individualistic, it is less communal, and that's a challenge. But I do see that coming into the church, and I guess my question is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Because in some ways I've seen that it has positive outcomes. People might be more balanced. There might be more of an emphasis on wellness and self-help, and it's about moderation. The Adventist Church has always talked about moderation and about balance and about the Adventist health message. So burning out from stress because you're following your convictions, or you're not able to look after your family because you're spending all your time, your energy, your money overseas, doing missionary work or whatever. Like, to some extent, there was a reaction to that. Perhaps, there's the old trope about how pastors' kids are, whatever, fill in the blanks. And I feel like some of that came from the pastor burning themselves out on the mission, the conviction, the surrendering everything to God and spending every dime they had to do that, and that perhaps there was resentment or difficulty because it was out of balance, maybe out of whack. And so some of this reaction might be healthy, might be more moderation, I guess, just to play the devil's advocate, moving away from some of that. So how in the individualistic, less communal society that we live in, how does surrender look there, and how do we do it in a healthy way, not a unhealthy way? How do we do that? How do we know what God is, where He's growing us and stretching us? Is this difficulty, is this challenge in my life God growing me and stretching me, or am I going too hard out and not having moderation or balance in my life? Or does moderation and balance not matter if you're getting stars in your crown and, it's the heavenly game that you're playing, the long game, not the, I'm playing for eternity. I'm not playing for this life. So my body, my mind, it doesn't matter because it's a short-term thing. I guess I don't have answers to any of those questions, but it's something to think about. Probably why we called this episode "Why is Surrender So Hard?" Because it can be it's hard to know what healthy surrender looks like. Maybe I'm sounding too individualistic. Maybe I'm saying healthy surrender. Is that an oxymoron? Like is
I think
it just
surrender,
all in?
I think surrender is also so hard because it's not like we can just look up the Greek or Hebrew word, because it's not really in the Bible. Like it doesn't.
Okay.
Surrender isn't really talked about unless it's in like a literal battle. Like it doesn't talk about it in the concept of like surrender to God or give this to Him. Like it's like something that we've come up with. But I think sorry, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, you mentioned that in your article. I'd like to explore that a little bit. What, where do you think it's come from then? If the word surrender is not in there, do we have some biblical basis for it? What can we look towards to understand what we've used surrender, I think, to interpret or to condense perhaps other teachings in the Bible, just to make it simple. Like, here's a word that encapsulates that. So I think the themes or the concepts are in there, but yeah, maybe we're doing it. Maybe we're out of balance because we haven't done a proper biblical theology of surrender.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll go back to your question before that in terms of like conviction, because my mind's in two places. But I think when you're talking about our convictions, I remember I had a friend once and he was trying to make a decision in terms of like whether to continue in the ministry role that he was already in or whether to go down this other path. And we had a conversation about like whether him staying in that ministry role was more so a conviction that God had put on him or something God was wanting him to do, or was he doing it more so because it was like people were expecting him to do that or people were relying on him to do that. And I think sometimes our convictions maybe come more so from our own minds or the people around us versus like God's direction.
Yes.
Which can be a hard thing to kind of identify, I suppose. Like you're going to have to really sit with that and think about that. Personally, but I think that's sometimes the case. Like we're more so convicted, not from God, but like other people's expectations and our own expectations of what we should do. And then we end up doing things out of like shoulds. And I think when we act because we should do something, it's never really like a wholehearted thing or a thing that we're deciding to do. It's more so like, all right, let's go. And so, yeah, I forget what your second question was, but
that's challenging. Well, just going back to the Bible, where do we get this concept from? And I guess one thing that we may have used interchangeably, I don't know if they're the same thing. Maybe we need to think through. But sacrifice, another S word. Are sacrifice and surrender the same? Because there's certainly sacrifice in terms of it's mentioned through the sacrificial system as a type, or through the Old Testament, it's like modeled, and then we see Jesus, and that context is often, take up your cross and follow me, lay down your life for your friends. Some of these verses that Jesus pulls out, I think, that we pull out from what Jesus said and his teachings and his example. I think maybe that's where we get surrender concepts from. One verse that's been in my mind as we've been having this conversation is that one, I think it's Philippians, where it says that he did not, being Jesus, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or something to be held onto, but lowered himself to serve, basically, is what that passage talks about. And it's like, maybe that's where we get some of these concepts of surrender, the example of Jesus, letting go of the control of the universe. Essentially, he was up there on the right hand of God, and then he lowered himself, came as a servant, let go of that control. And maybe that's where we look at our online. Charles has talked about conformity. Romans 12 verse 2, do not be conformed to this world. Do not surrender. He says, suggesting maybe that's a surrender concept. Don't surrender to the world, but surrender to God, and doing God's will and living God's will in your life. So perhaps it's there. Yeah, I'm not sure where the biblical word comes from, if the word surrender is not actually in the text much.
Maybe one of our viewers can Google it for us. There is a verse that I think of, I've been thinking of in terms of surrender lately. I think it's in Ephesians 6 when it talks about like the armor of God, and it says, like, after it says put on the full armor of God, it says then stand. So it's like after you've done all you can do, just stand. It's basically what it says, which again is that like giving up control, or again it's that like letting go, which I think that sometimes, like, that's our classic view of surrender, I suppose.
Right.
But then you have cases like Moses, for example. Like, I would argue Moses had to surrender a lot. Like, he could see that his behavior wasn't good, so he left Egypt. And then he didn't want to answer God's calls. He gave a lot of excuses not to, but in the end he went and surrendered, I suppose. Like, it didn't mean that he stopped doing anything. If anything, he went on to do more than ever. Like, yeah.
Yes. Someone I've heard people talk about that armor that Paul mentions, and there's no armor on the back. So they can't turn around. That concept of standing, don't turn around, you'll get stabbed in the back, sort of thing. As in, you have to face what's coming, which is what we've talked about a little bit, and it's going with the flow. But you're preparing yourself. You're in God's space. You've got God surrounding you, essentially, in that passage to enable you to stand against what life throws at you, the enemy's darts, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's like someone else described surrender to me like being a salmon down a stream. Because if you're trying to swim against the current, it's going to be exhausting. But if you just like go with the flow, then you'll go where you need to be.
Yeah. But we should also swim against the current. I used to have a t-shirt when I was little that was one of my favorite t-shirts. It had all these ugly cartoon fish, all these crazy designed fish, and they're all going in a certain direction, sort of thing. And then a bit of a Jesus fish was going in the other direction, and it was like kind of very simple, the Jesus fish. And it was saying, I think that verse that Charles mentioned, Romans 12 verse 2, was listed or referenced on the shirt. Don't conform to the currents of the world, but be transformed. I guess what that brings up in terms of surrender is how do we swim against the current, but be flowing with God's current, like God's will. How do we know God's will? A lot of what we've talked about is like, hey, surrender, do what God says. But how do we even know what? I mean, we've got the Bible, right? We've got all the precepts and principles. Those are important. The moral standards, all of that stuff. But how do we actually know what God specifically wants for us?
I feel like we could do maybe like a series on answering that, but
A whole episode. Yeah.
yeah, maybe more than an episode. But I don't know.
Yep.
Something I do when I'm responding to something is like, am I responding to this in line with like God's character, or like is this? It's like the classic WWJD thing, but like if Jesus were here, like what decision might he make? Or like, and that's not always easy. Like you can't always ask that question
Yep.
and it will give you a certain answer or direction. Like sometimes you just have to go down that path and then test it, kind of thing. But I think in terms of surrendering in my own experience, it's kind of like, how would God respond in this? And it's going back to that question, like, is he teaching me something in this, or do I actually need to learn to trust him? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've found in my own life, and these become dirty words these days. Discipline, church, church discipline, or spiritual disciplines. They're not sort of popular concepts. I don't hear a lot of people talking about them. But I guess fasting and praying, I've found it's not like a magic formula. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. If you do such and such, you will get the outcome that you desire, or God will definitely answer you, or whatever. But I have found, and I don't do it all the time. I don't do it well. I haven't done it recently much in terms of fasting, but I have had times in my life where I've had a big decision that's really worried me, stressed me. How do I find God's will in this situation? And to me, at those times, some of those spiritual disciplines really come through. And I don't think God doesn't necessarily give me a clear-cut answer right away. Sometimes it takes many months to really figure it out, or you feel just in your spirit, you feel just dissatisfied or uncomfortable. It's maybe God's prodding you, in a different direction, or giving you something else to think about, or preparing you to know that something's going to change. But I think those spiritual disciplines are a bit underrated or underappreciated, because we don't want to use a formula. We don't want to say, do this and God will do this, fast, pray certain amount of times, and once you hit your quota, God's going to jump in and fix things. But at the same time, I think we neglect some of those things to our detriment. Like we miss out knowing God's will because we're not in an attitude or a posture of humility and being receptive, I guess, to God's will. We don't give it the time. Okay, there's a big decision. Well, maybe God can do His will in me in both sides of the decision, but also maybe there's one that He more specifically wants me to do. But have I fasted? Have I prayed? Have I sought wisdom from spiritual elders? People who seem to have a good connection with God and the Holy Spirit. Like, am I actually seeking any help from anyone, or am I trying to do it on my own?
Yeah. It makes me think of the verses in the Bible that talk about how trials make us stronger, which and this might be a bit of a tangent, but I think trials can make you stronger. But I think we all know people where trials have actually made people bitter or resentful or unforgiving, and so it's almost like it goes back to that free will choice thing. Trials can make us incredible people, and they can make us better and more resilient and patient, but it depends how we react to those trials or respond to those trials. And again, that's in our hands. That's our choice as to what we're going to do with that, and whether we're going to I don't know, surrender or learn what God's trying to teach us there, or whether we're going to fight that and try to control the circumstances again, and I guess react in our human nature. Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And is God, I think it brings up the question, is God with us in our trial? Do we allow Him to be with us in those trials? Because sometimes we can wrestle, but we don't actually, I think the difference is that, and I'm not going to say anything for one side of the conversation, but certainly for many people that I know that have come through trials stronger and more patience and perseverance and whatever, they have very closely felt the presence of God in the midst of the storm, sort of thing. So basically, I guess what I'm saying is that having God in our lives, in our being in His will, as in us surrendering to Him and saying, "Hey God, I'll do what you want me to do." Even when sometimes difficult things come, if we're in that posture, like I talked about before, having an attitude of it, or being ready for it, if God's right there in the midst of it with us, sometimes that helps us maybe survive those a little bit better. I think, in my experience, I've seen that. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Yep.
Prior to you editing my piece for the record, what was your understanding of surrender?
I don't think surrender as a term or as a concept I sort of thought about much lately, recently, but I did. Some of this conversation to me is bringing back or drawing on different experiences. I remember once, many years ago for Record, I wrote like a 3-part series on, or 2 or 3 parts on knowing God's will. How do I know God's will? And I guess I've wrestled with that a lot in my life. Like, am I in God's will? How do I know God's will? How do I find it? So I've had some interesting, I guess, concepts or ideas or learnings, I guess, from the Holy Spirit over the years in that. One thing that I am somewhat convicted on is that God may not have as individualistic a plan for us as we may think. You know, that what I talked about, one way is the only right way. I have to get on that track, and if I'm off it, I'm in trouble. Because I do think the Bible was written to a much more communal society, and we see some heroes in the Bible, but they're the exceptions. Out of millions or billions of people that have ever lived, they're the ones that really supernatural, crazy stuff happened to. For the rest of us, God has some guidelines, some help, some presence. I do believe He's interested in our individual lives, like every hair on my head. I get that, he cares for me personally, and He knew me in my mother's womb and all of that stuff. But maybe His will or His expectations for my life is maybe a bit more generic. Like, He wants all of us to make disciples. He wants all of us to live good lives, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Some of those principles, they're very clear and very communal. We all need to be doing some of those things. The other thing that I think from time to time about is sacrifice. I guess that word comes to mind more often than, say, surrender. Unless we're singing "I Surrender All" sort of at church, we sort of do that by rote and we don't sort of think about it too much. But I wrote an article for the November Signs recently about sacrifice, and I guess reflecting on that from time to time, quite often, what does that look like in my life? I ask myself, how can I best serve God? And I guess as I get older, this is the question, this is the wrestle. As you get older, it's like you want to provide for your family. So you're getting the big questions. Do I buy a house? Where do I buy a house? Do I not? And I've often been challenged by well, is it more missional to be able to just travel or go where God needs me to do? Should I save money and rent and then put more money into mission? Am I even doing that? Am I giving offerings or extra help or, And so I guess that's where the question comes to me lately, like, how much do I set up for myself and my future, my daughter, her future, my family, or do I sacrifice for the kingdom? What does that look like? I guess that's the practical, that's the real day-to-day gritty stuff. It's like, oh, well, it sounds good in theory to go do such and such for God, but also, does God want me to be stable, to be, does God send me to a certain demographic that I'm, in and I'm comfortable and that's where I am? And are those the people that God needs me to influence? And so I don't have to be a Mother Teresa in the slums of Calcutta. Is that not my calling? Is that not my my place. And so I guess I wrestle with questions like that quite often, on and off.
I do too.
It's definitely related to surrender. I think maybe the words or the terms that we put on it are different, but it's just something that we wrestle with. Hey, Charles is thanks for watching, Charles, and whoever else has been online as well. Charles is really providing some good feedback, some great Bible verses that he's sharing. The yielding of self, surrendering all to the will of God, requires a struggle, but the soul must submit to God before it can be renewed in holiness. I think we're running low on time, but I was in Fiji the other week for the first time for years because of COVID and stuff, and they asked me to do a chapel in the boys' dorm one of the evenings that I was there at Fulton College, and it was a real, when I think of sacrifice, when I think of conviction, I think of my grandparents' generation. My grandparents. My mum grew up in Fiji. Her whole schooling was done out there because she was a missionary kid. She was at Fulton College, the old campus, and so to me, it's awesome to go out and serve in the islands and to meet people in the Pacific, because knowing that it's been a big part of my family history. My faith comes from, we all have to get our own faith for ourselves, but there have been people it's nice to know that people in my line have been convicted and have had a passion for service, but I was doing this worship with the guys, and basically I did it without notes. I just told them some of my stories, some of my wrestling with what God's will is, and I told them that the best decision that they can make, the best decision that I've ever made, is to say to God, whatever you want me to do, that's what I'm going to do. Now, I don't always get that right, but in terms of my career, the big decisions in my life, I've followed that principle, and I've wrestled with it, and I've not wanted to do what God seemed like he was leading me to do at times, but I've always stuck to that, and I feel very blessed to be where I am today, doing what I'm doing, and I do see God leading in that space because I've made that decision, because I've made that conviction. So yeah, for me, that's where I would leave it maybe today, but that's been my story, to say to God, whatever you want for my life, I'm going to do my best at doing it.
Yeah, I guess for me, when I found it difficult to answer that or to define what that choice is, I've asked, like, well, what is the most loving thing to do in this situation?
Yes.
I guess in terms of relationships, that's helped me to like make a decision as to what to do or how to respond. Like, is this action in line with like my gifts or with what I have, or can I make this decision with what I own, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Oh,
very cool. Well, we hope that this has helped you today. I think it's been good to unpack and wrestle with some of these concepts. And if you can, read Zanita's article in the October 1 issue of Adventist Record, please do. And it'll be on our website as well. If you're not getting the printed copy anymore, you'll be able to see that up on our website. But thanks, Zanita, for sharing today and for stimulating this conversation with your very good article. I really enjoyed your article. So I hope everyone else out there can have a read and have a think. And yeah, maybe you guys out there, if you're watching, listening, seek God's will in your life this week and see if you can't surrender a few things to just see what God can do with you and how he can grow you and what that looks like.
Awesome. Thanks for wrestling through the topic with me, Jared.
No worries. It's been fun. And thanks to Charles and all those who have watched today. It's great to have you, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Awesome.